Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. It's great to see so many faces there. I actually just got back from my last trip to Syria on Friday, so I'm pretty fresh from chemical attacks in Aleppo and actually the amazing liberation of the kidnapped victims from Sweden. The 29 kidnapped victims, mostly women and children, who were kidnapped on the 25th of July of this year by ISIS after an attack on Sweden countryside and Sweden city that left 270 civilians dead, most of them massacred while they were sleeping. The attack began at 4 a.m. And was definitely enabled by the US coalition. And ISIS terrorists who fled the attack, having been pushed back by very poorly armed civilian defenders of those villages and the city, were then given protection by the US coalition. And in fact, the rescue operation took about 3 months in planning for the Syrian Arab Army to get close enough to the ISIS positions to actually be able to attack and rescue 23 of the 29 kidnapped victims. 3 were actually executed, 2 women and 1 young man were executed, beheaded by ISIS. 1 woman was left to die on the route. She was too elderly and too sick to keep moving, so ISIS basically just left her there to die. And 2 children, 2 boys, Qusay and Arafat, were actually killed during the liberation campaign by friendly fire, unfortunately. But 23 of those kidnapped victims were returned to their families, and I visited them actually last Thursday. So quite extraordinary, you know, completely goes against the narrative that the Syrian Arab Army is killing its own people. Nonsense. The Syrian Arab Army is the Syrian people. I can't stress that strongly enough. But that's not the subject of my talk tonight. What I'm going to be doing, I hope, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I possibly can, is to demonstrate really the high finance, what I call Anthropo Capitalist billionaire network that is actually behind many of these regime change wars or these humanitarian intervention wars that we've been seeing, but particularly what we're seeing now unroll in Syria for the last 8 years. What I want to do first, though, because basically the billionaire complex is what you don't see. The white helmets are who you do see, and you see them very, very publicly. You see them very extensively and on very, very major platforms. So what I'm going to do to begin with is just to I'm guessing most of you are aware of who the White Helmets are. You're aware of their role in the regime change war in Syria, so I don't need to give you too much background on that. But what I want to do is to just recap a little bit and go over my meeting with actual White Helmets in the south of Syria in September, when I actually rather inadvertently entered a functioning White Helmet Centre in Dar al-Balad, which was still under control of the armed groups. And we slightly stumbled into the White Helmet Centre. I think what actually saved me was the fact I was British, and they assumed I was there to up their funding. So somehow I managed to get through the interview with 2 White Helmets and one of the leading armed group leaders who for 7 years had actually been massacring civilians and army in Dada. So what I want to draw your attention to, because it's a very important connection to what I'm going to be saying throughout the presentation, is that this was an actual British government document that was published in April 2017, outlining the funding coming in from the Conflict, Security and Stability Fund to a number of organisations involved in implementing regime change in Syria, and among those, of course, are the white helmets, but also intermediaries that are basically funneling that financing to the white helmets, which include in the US Chemonics, and as you see at the bottom there, Mayday Rescue. So this is basically the budget from April 2017 to March 2020 to go to these organizations, including, well, which are the white helmets. But what is very important here is that part of this document, this extraordinary statement was made that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have stated that the Syria, I won't call them the Syria Civil Defense because they're not the Syria Civil Defense, the white helmets are their most routinely reliable source for reporting. So basically, the two organizations that have a revolving door relationship with the CIA and deep state organizations are relying entirely on another deep state construct, the white helmets, to corroborate the evidence that they need to basically get support for regime change, military intervention in Syria. And again, the wording is quite extraordinary. Throughout the bombardment by Russia since September 2015, the white helmets have provided essential corroboration that strikes were not targeting Daesh, but moderate opposition entities. Now, I mean, here we have two absolute rank hypocrisy statements. One, in other words, the white helmets are providing evidence that corroborates an existing foreign policy. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement to make. Shouldn't the policy be based upon the evidence that's coming from the ground, not the other way round? But also, again, supporting this idea that there are any moderate opposition entities. This has been discredited almost universally, except by those who, of course, are still trying to maintain the propaganda narrative, probably implemented by Charles Lister and supported by David Cameron, that there were 70,000 moderate opposition. That has been proven to be nonsense. But a very interesting point has come up. I mean, I mentioned the revolving door relationship between organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But very recently, Our Hidden History on Twitter just put out a statement that Louis Kuttner, co-founder of Amnesty International, had planned to open an office of another NGO, World Habeas Corpus, in Beijing, of course another target nation. If the CIA would pay for it, Kuttner would allow CIA to staff it completely with our own people. He's actually put a link to the document for that, but I mean, this is quite an extraordinary exposure. Another extraordinary bit of information that's come out in the last few weeks, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, is the network of networks, the cluster of disinformation set up predominantly by the British government, Integrity Initiative. As it says, it was set up in autumn 2015 by the Institute for Statecraft in cooperation with the Free University of Brussels to bring to the attention of politicians, policymakers, opinion leaders and other interested parties the threat posed by Russia to democratic institutions in the UK, across Europe and North America. So basically what this is, and it includes the actual cluster itself. There are a number of clusters working in a number of areas globally. But in this particular cluster, you will find, I believe it's a BBC journalist, a number of government and media actors. But perhaps unsurprisingly, in one part of the document, they talk about regular educational seminars in London with expert speakers addressing key issues to educate core team and clusters. And in amongst that, we find the white helmets, the UK Foreign Office propaganda construct set up by a former MI6 agent. And of course, also as part of this particular section of the document, we find the focus on the political war on chemical weapon use in Syria. Again, a very strange wording. If chemical weapons are being used, this becomes a humanitarian issue. It becomes a war crime issue. It certainly shouldn't be a political war. But of course, we know perfectly well that chemical weapon use is being politicized and it is being instrumentalized against the Syrian government and its allies. As I mentioned, when I was in Syria in September, I met with the white helmets in Daraa, This is Abu Mohammed al-Mahamid, who was actually the leader of that particular white helmet group. And what was interesting again, as we actually entered from this area here and drove into this sort of empty yard area here. But this, and this is customary for any white helmet centre, the biggest building on the left or behind us was the Nusra Front Centre, the former Al-Qaeda centre, and the White Helmet Centre, of course, was in the same compound. That we see in almost every liberated area, liberated from terrorist occupation in Syria. But then what was interesting, walking into the centre, all of the equipment was from the UK, including the jackets, and as you'll see, a fire engine. And they were actually very keen to tell me that they were being funded by James Le Mesurier and Mayday Rescue. So they didn't try and conceal anything from me. As I say, the funding had actually been cut off about 6 months prior to that. So there's the British fire engine. So I think they were keen actually to try and sell the whole concept of refunding them. And they assumed that I was going to take their positive image back to the British government.
Why were they defunded?
We don't actually know what it might be. They weren't very complimentary about Raed Saleh, who's the leader of the White Helmets. In their opinion, he'd buggered off to Turkey and basically abandoned them. So they were very critical of him. It could be just very simply that because the area at that point was under reconciliation discussions, so they assumed it would go back to the Syrian government control. I mean, they actually, this is another thing, because the myth prior to the special evacuation through Israel of a number of White Helmet operatives and Al-Qaeda leaders was that if they were to stay in the area, they would be under threat from the Syrian government. But actually, these White Helmets were telling us, no, it's fine. We get all our services, all our electricity, all our water from the Syrian government. We don't have a problem with continuing to operate. So on two levels, they sort of exposed the falsehood in the narratives from the mainstream media and obviously from the US coalition governmental alliance. When I mentioned the fact that in every single area, the Al-Qaeda centers were either shared facilities. Very often in another area in the south, in Quneitra, I actually visited centers where Al-Qaeda were in the same building as the White Helmets, where torture rooms and prisons were actually underground or next door to the White Helmet centers. This is actually a town called Madik Citadel, which is to the north of Hama, right on the borders with what is now the kind of terrorist stronghold in Idlib. And I'm actually taking this photograph from about 400 meters away. And this building is a White Helmet center. This entire town is occupied predominantly by Nusra Front, but also Jaish al-Islam and Arar Sham. Jaish al-Islam, of course, the British government is paying for their PR, effectively to whitewash one of the most brutal terrorist organizations in Syria that is not designated a terrorist organization by the so-called international community. But Al-Skelbiye, which is the Christian town that I was in to take this photo, had just that day come under attack by cluster munitions from this town, fired by those various terrorist groups into civilian areas in Skelbiye. The day before, Mahade, another Christian town, had been targeted also by cluster munitions. 13 civilians had been massacred in that attack, including one entire family, the mother, the wife, and the 3 children, leaving only the husband as a survivor. So again, we see the White Helmets operating in close proximity with the terrorist groups. And again, just reiterating that fact, this is in Eastern Ghouta in Sakbar, going through the White Helmet former centre, which again was right next door to actually a bomb-making factory run by Jaish al-Islam, from memory. We found Tamkeen jackets. Now, when I mentioned the UK Foreign Office funding, two other intermediaries were Adam Smith International and Integrity Consulting, interesting similar name to Integrity Initiative, who set up an initiative or a project called Tamkeen, which basically supported what they term as civil society, so the local councils, the White Helmets, the Free Syrian Police. What I demonstrated very, very clearly in East Aleppo is the connection between all of those entities, those so-called civil society entities, and the terrorist groups. I apologize for some of these images, but the White Helmet group in Dar al-Balad were actually responsible for at least two executions, one in May 2017 and one in June 2017. This was the one in June, which was when an air defense base, to the south of Daraa was overrun by the armed groups. A number of Syrian Arab Army soldiers were massacred. Their bodies were brought back. We've actually managed to geolocate where they were brought back to, and they were brought back very close to the White Helmet Centre that I visited. And I was told, Eva Bartlett, who also visited Daraa shortly before me, she managed to get testimony from civilians that the White Helmets had basically chopped up the bodies of Syrian Arab Army soldiers. They put them in plastic bags and dumped them in the tip. And this video was actually released of one of the White Helmet operatives doing exactly that. Of course, the White Helmets that we met and spoke with said to us, well, if anyone was involved in executions, we sacked them. Great. One of the things, two of the interesting things that he actually admitted to me, one was that the majority of those that left via the Israeli evacuation and then came into Jordan and then potentially came into the UK, because there are a number of alleged White Helmets who have been resettled in the UK. Of those, a large majority, or a large number, were members of terrorist groups, were members of militant groups, including Nusra Front. But what he also said, which was quite interesting, because we pushed him on the fact that, well, the White Helmets have a reputation for being affiliated with Nusra Front, and he actually at one point responded and said, yes, of course they are. And if they are Nusra Front and they run a White Helmet Centre, so this means all his colleagues are also Nusra Front, which is exactly the argument that I've been giving for the last, since the creation of the White Helmets, is that they cannot operate, they cannot work so closely or in such close collaboration with Nusra Front without adhering to that ideology. They wouldn't be able to survive. So this was actually confirmed by a White Helmet leader. We actually ascertained that this particular White Helmet group had very close ties to what is euphemistically called the Free Syrian Army. But the particular group of Free Syrian Army that they were affiliated to were responsible for a number of atrocities carried out through Daraa and that southern region. But then going back to, as I mentioned, East Aleppo, again, I demonstrated very clearly that the Aleppo White Helmet leadership, and if you remember I just mentioned Tamkeen set up the local councils, so funded by the British government through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. And this man, Abdulaziz Maghribi, was not only president of that local council, so funded by Tamkeen, he was also the founder of the White Helmet chapter in East Aleppo, but he was an active member of Nusra Front and an active member of Abu Amara, which were one of the most brutal groups in East Aleppo. They were effectively the protection racket group for Nusra Front. If anybody wants to check that out, that's the actual article that covers Tamkeen, Integrity, Adam Smith, and the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. And finally, some of you have probably seen this. But the white helmets are regularly praised by members. Abu Jabal was actually the emir of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is one of the rebrands of Al-Qaeda. But Abdullah Muhaizini, who's another infamous Riyadh-funded terrorist group leader in Idlib, has also publicly praised them on a number of occasions. So what I want to do now is to get on, so that was just basically a recap to update you on where we are with evidence against the white helmets. But what I want to do now is to focus on the Joe Cox Fund, which was extraordinarily set up within 24 hours of Joe Cox's murder in June 2016 by what we've termed the Joe Cox Four. I'll go into more detail as I go into the presentation. But on the left you have Nick Grono, Mabel Van Orange, Gemma Mortensen and Tim Dixon, and of course Brendan Cox, Joe Cox's husband. Now those articles have been published at Mint Press News. They've been co-written by myself and an amazing journalist, Whitney Webb. I'm very proud to have worked with her. And those three, so it's 3 parts so far, there's another 2 parts coming, are up at Mint Press News. So that's the first one. Second one, where we go into detail about the transition from the Balkans to Syria and the parallels between the shadow state constructs that have been established by the British government. And finally, the billionaire complex, the oligarchs behind the humanitarian regime change. I just want to read you, this is a quote from Professor Piers Robinson, who works at the Department of Journalism Studies in the University of Sheffield, but he's also the convener of the working group, the academic working group on Syria, propaganda and media, and they've been doing some amazing work on particularly the chemical weapon attacks, but also right now they're working on the Integrity Initiative project. So what he basically said was, understanding the way in which power is exercised in democracies requires careful and detailed exploration of power networks. In the contemporary world, these involve relationships between state actors, political movements, think tanks in particular, business interests, and also popular culture and celebrity politics. Think George Clooney, Angelina Jolie. Part of modern-day propaganda operations aimed at mobilization of bias involve power, political and economic actors co-opting media and popular culture celebrities in order to promote particular worldviews, shape public understanding, and to concrete political outcomes. So tonight, because the 3 articles are incredibly complex and do contain a huge amount of information, so to some degree I'm going to focus on the first one tonight and try to demonstrate the extent of the network and the resources behind these regime change wars, behind these illegal interventions into sovereign nations that are simply not complying with imperialist practice. So first of all, who was Joe Cox? Well, you know, when I started writing these articles, we kind of thought, oh, because to such a large degree, Joe Cox has been sanctified since her murder, you know, and it was a terrible event. But I think we have to be very honest about who she actually was. She was a tireless advocate for the Syrian moderate opposition. She was a supporter of the UK Foreign Office financed and created propaganda construct, as John Pilger calls them, the White Helmets. She was a member of the Fabian Society, which has more recently actively been furthering the globalist policies of the UK government. She upheld the myth that the Syrian government had created ISIS. She claimed that Syria was not another Iraq, despite the very clear evidence that Syria was a progression from Iraq. If you look back over The Chilcot report, if you look at the communiques between Bush and Blair, it was very clear that Syria was in the pipeline after Iraq, particularly if it didn't come into line, which of course, as we know, as history has shown us, it didn't. She was a fierce advocate for refugees, while actually not addressing the cause of the exodus from Syria, which was actually a far lesser exodus than has been described, of course, by those who are trying to sensationalize and amplify the refugee crisis for their own needs. She voted against the bombing in 2013, but only because she actually felt that Cameron should go further and should put British boots on the ground in Syria, although of course there are British boots on the ground in Syria. What has happened since her death is that her image, her reputation, has been used to actually further iconize the White Helmets and protect them from criticism. If you ever watch a single British politician being put under pressure, particularly Andrew Mitchell, quite recently, I think last year, on RT Going Underground, when Afshan Rattanzi, who does a fantastic job, actually started to pressure him about who the White Helmets were, he immediately went in, but Joe Cox advocated for them, Joe Cox supported them. So it's almost like Joe Cox's name becomes a talisman with which this group, which is protected across the board by all of the capitalist organizations, by the entire hybrid war complex, Joe Cox is used as further protectionism for this organization. Channel 4, of course, very quickly jumped on this bandwagon and produced a report, Joe Cox and the White Helmets. Again, I won't go into it too much here because otherwise I'm going to be here all night. But Channel 4 are effectively instrumental in the production and promotion of the White Helmet movies, including the Netflix documentary and Last Men in Aleppo, both of which, of course, were, well, the Netflix documentary won the Oscar. Last Men in Aleppo was nominated for it. But if you want to look into that further, I have extensively investigated. But Channel 4 are instrumental in the production of those movies, the promotion of those movies, and by default, the promotion of the White Helmets.
Is that Robert Redford there?
Yeah. Sundance Institute, also responsible for the promotion of the White Helmet movies. So, what I want to do now, as I say, I'm sort of a little bit pushed for time to go into huge detail. What I want to look at is what we call the Joe Cox 4, although there's 5, but that includes Brendan Cox. But if we look at those who immediately set up the Joe Cox Fund to basically raise a huge amount of money, it's actually over 1.5 million, for a number of charities that were supported by Joe Cox, which include the White Helmets, Hope Not Hate, and I can't remember the third one right now. But let's just take a look at who these people are and how far back their connections go and to what extent they've been involved in previous regime change operations. So Mabel Van Orange on the top left. She's notable really for her involvement in the soft power complex elite. She's currently the CEO of an NGO called Girls Not Brides, but she's more infamous, as we described in our article, for the co-founding of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a globalist pan-European think tank whose members are a mix of EU politicians and top figures in the European media. However, it's more than just a think tank, given that it is essentially an extension of one powerful and controversial billionaire, and I'll give you 3 guesses who that is. Yes. Who's George Soros, whose Open Society Foundation was largely responsible for providing ECFR's initial funding. Her connections to Soros only get deeper as one examines her past. She was the director of EU affairs of Soros's Open Society Institute, beginning in 1997 until 2002, when she became International Advocacy Director for the Open Society Institute's branch in London. Notably, of course, George Soros is one of the chief funders behind the most prominent NGOs and other humanitarian organizations that have consistently promoted Western military intervention in the Syrian conflict. Yet probably, and this is where it will tie into the Balkans, one of her most striking connections in the context of Syria was perhaps one of her first. In '93, Van Orange, at the age of 25 and just out of university, founded the European Action Council for Peace in the Balkans and served as its CEO until '97, when she left to join Soros's Open Society. Despite its name appearing to advocate for peace in the Balkans, the group Van Orange founded was instead stocked with powerful US political figures who advocated for anything but peace in the Balkan states. Those included Brzezinski, National Security Advisor under former US President Jimmy Carter, Frank Carlucci, Deputy CIA Director under Carter, Deputy Secretary of Defense under former US President Ronald Reagan, and a number of other prominent globalists. Unsurprisingly, the European Action Council for Peace in the Balkans actually issued a call in '95 under Van Orange's leadership for an end to the arms embargo against Bosnia, the withdrawal of the UN forces from Bosnia, and an effective NATO air campaign. And the rest is a hideous history for former Yugoslavia. On the right, you have Nick Grono. He previously worked with Joe Cox at an NGO, an anti-slavery NGO called the Freedom Fund. He was Deputy President and Chief Operating Officer at the Cutting Edge Conflict Resolution and Prevention Cartel, commonly known as the International Crisis Group, which is responsible for manufacturing consent for a number of interventions globally. The Freedom Fund was first announced by former US President Bill Clinton at the 2013 Clinton Global Initiative meeting in New York. It was founded with $30 million, provided by 3 philanthropic foundations of powerful billionaires and financial interests. Humanity United, funded by Pierre Omidyar and his wife Pamela, the Legatum Foundation, the development arm of the Legatum Group, a global private investment firm connected to mega banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and the Minderoo Foundation, the foundation of Australian mining oligarch and the country's richest man, Andrew Forrest, and his wife Nicola. So almost immediately we see the extent to which this network is beginning to expand into the oligarch complex, which, as I said, is what is behind the instruments that you see on the ground inside Syria. Grono is also on the board of Mabel Van Orange's NGO Girls Not Brides. So again, they're very closely connected. And this is what I'm trying to show, is that how this complex works. It's a very closely interlinked complex, basically ever-changing. They can react very quickly. If, for example, as I was explaining, if one NGO is discredited, they can simply rebrand and reproduce another one. The resources behind this complex are vast. Bottom left is Tim Dixon, co-founder of Purpose Europe, which is a branch of the Avaz. Avaz is the petition site that basically is a behavioral change organization. What it does is to tap into public opinion and also to manipulate public opinion. They were actually very responsible at the beginning of the conflict of providing the communication systems to the so-called moderate opposition in the hot areas like Dada, and basically raising public support, manufacturing consent for support of the moderate opposition inside Syria. Purpose are behavioral change experts that market themselves as non-profit while accepting donor contributions from some of the most influential foundations and political change drivers, such as Google. According to Corey Morningstar, a pioneer researcher into the not-for-profit industrial complex, Corey mentioned where, under the organization of Avaz, the public hadn't acquiesced to an airstrike on Syria, the New York public relations firm Purpose has stepped in. Purpose is also involved in the chain of the creation of the white helmets, which came from Avaz to Purpose, and Purpose then incubated the white helmets, the Syria campaign. Syria campaign is funded by Ayman Safari, who also funds the Tory government. So again, I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm just trying to give the impression of the depth and the extent of these connections and how they are effectively influencing. I mean, we talk about Russian influence on American elections, but when you look at the insane influence that these capitalists are having upon our political environment, our foreign policy environment, I think it's terrifying. Bottom right, Gemma Mortensen. She basically is involved with an organisation called Crisis Action. Brendan Cox, the husband of Joe Cox, was executive director of Crisis Action 2006 to 2009. Gemma Mortensen has been with them from 2006 until 2015. Again, Crisis Action are a catalyst, how they describe themselves, a catalyst for global change. Tim Dixon is also involved with Crisis Action. Gemma Mortensen is also on the board of Change.org, another behavioural insight influencing organisation, very similar to ours, puts out petitions, controls public opinion. But Crisis Action, Crisis Action, also on the board of Crisis Action, Mabel Van Orange. So again, you're seeing how all of these people interconnect into this Joe Cox fund, into this project. Crisis Action partners are an impressive collection of virtually all the human rights organisations. When you actually go to their website, they include Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Save the Children, Mercy Corps, International Crisis Group, and many more that work as extensions of US, UK state foreign policy in a chosen conflict zone. In fact, the Crisis Action Network is one of the most expansive webs of the NGOs prevalent in providing cover for multiple regime change wars. And among the Syria-related NGOs under the Crisis Action umbrella, we find Syria Campaign, who basically run the PR campaigns for the White Helmets, Avaz, 38 Degrees, which is a branch of Avaz, the UN Foundation, again, heavily connected to the Clinton Foundation. The CEO of the UN Foundation, Kathy Calvin, came from, I told you, came from actually Hill and Knowlton. I don't need to mention what Hill and Knowlton did in the incubator baby scandal, which of course took us to war against Iraq. And she is heavily connected, the UN Foundation is heavily connected back to the Clintons. In fact, every single one of these connections leads back to the Clinton Global Initiative. Mosaic Syria, Chatham House, unsurprisingly. Chatham House also has a direct connection to the White Helmets. Asad Hanna, who is the White Helmets media and advocacy manager, contributes to Chatham House. And Chatham House have actually led annual general meetings for the White Helmets in Gaziantep in Turkey. They also include the Muslim Council of Britain, which is heavily influenced by Islamist organisations like the Muslim Brotherhood, who have long been an instrument of destabilisation, a British construct, of course, established in Egypt, and have been used as an instrument of destabilisation in Syria and the region for the US coalition. Many of these crisis action partners were actually listed as supporters of the White Helmets in the run-up to the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016, which luckily they failed to get. And many observers at that point were horrified to see an organisation like Greenpeace, also a member of the Crisis Action Coalition, publicly supporting the White Helmets. But what was even more extraordinary was when a number of people wrote to Greenpeace and said, what on earth are you doing? I mean, why is Greenpeace effectively supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria? The response was an absolute test case, a script from Syria Campaign. It basically said, oh yes, we know all about the disinformation campaign against the White Helmets, which of course is led by Russian agents. And as far as we know, they're, tailors, doctors, carpenters, and bakers rescuing children from under the rubble. So fundamentally, Greenpeace utterly reneged on its responsibility to the public. As a public influencer, it did not investigate the White Helmets. It simply put out a standard reply that, in my opinion, was fed to them by Syria Campaign or by a member of the PR agencies running the White Helmets. According to the Crisis Action report and statements from its sponsors, Crisis Action has heavily influenced and covertly managed events in Sudan, Congo, Gaza, Afghanistan, Ivory Coast, Egypt, Libya, and now Syria. It claims to amplify the voices of Syrian heroes, which of course, in their view, include the White Helmets, lauded by Crisis Action as an awe-inspiring feature of the last 6 years. One of the Crisis Action and Change.org projects, it's actually up at the Crisis Action website. I don't know if you all remember, as East Aleppo was being liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies, we were constantly being bombarded with the story of the last doctor in Aleppo. Well, this particular last doctor, Dr. Hamza al-Khatib, who was the one who wrote the letter to Obama at the time demanding effectively a no-fly zone, which is effectively a declaration of war against Russia at that time by the US. He's not even a doctor, by the way. His real name is Ihad Kataji. He never qualified from Aleppo University. We actually checked with Aleppo University. He never qualified. He never finished his last year. Not only that, but through his own personal commentary on Facebook, he was in league with the terrorist groups in East Aleppo, including Nour al-Zinki, who beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian child Abdullah Isa in July 2016. But this is who they iconized as the hero of Aleppo. Crisis Action also collaborated with an organization called BOND, which is the umbrella group for the British Overseas Development Agencies, to help shape a vision for Britain's role in the world post-Brexit. Kieran Norris was political affairs advisor at BOND from 2014 to 2016, before he became a director of an organization called the Rising Global Peace Forum from 2016 to 17. He's currently head of external affairs at Oxfam, so again we see this constantly percolating exchange of personalities from one NGO to another. While director at the Rising Global Peace Forum, Norris awarded the Peace Prize in 2016 to Joe Cox and the White Helmets. So what we're seeing here, and I'm hoping you're kind of picking up on the picture here, is the depth of the roots of these organizations back to the global elite, back to the ruling entities within the US coalition, to the intelligence agencies, to the capitalist complex, that is all acting as a protection racket for the White Helmets, which is effectively an intelligence propaganda construct, and maybe more than that. James Le Mesurier. James Le Mesurier was former MI6, although we always suspected that. That was recently confirmed in a fairly recent Guardian article. And what I want to show, because this was a very important element that came out of my work on the Joe Cox Fund, basically we see what happened in the Balkans as a blueprint for what then happened in Syria. And Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who many of you may well know, who's a very dear friend and a very esteemed analyst, actually said, Yugoslavia and the Serbs were the first victims of the American-led unipolar world that emerged in '91, because it was in Yugoslavia, namely Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo, where the US and its principal ally Britain, together with Germany, destroyed the sanctity of internationally recognized borders, disregarded the authority of the United Nations Security Council, dealt irrevocable damage to the United Nations Charter by having undermined legitimate state authorities and having supported with arms, training, money, logistics and intelligence information armed secessionist movements, which comprised fascist, Islamist, and organized crime groups, facilitated the arrival of mujahideen and jihadist fighters to the region, employed their respective media outlets to demonize the people standing in the way of their objectives, the Serbs, accusing them of mass murder and genocide, thus justifying the West's policy in the Balkans, and then directly intervened with military force to guarantee the accomplishment of their objectives. In short, Yugoslavia was the template for Iraq, Libya, and Syria. When I looked into James Le Mesurier's role in Kosovo, initially it was very hard for me to get any information. He'd basically been wiped from the records. He worked in the office as the High Representative. I even had somebody go back through the records there. His name had been completely erased. But what I managed to do through Marcus, actually, was to contact somebody who had been in Pristina at that time. And what he did was to confirm the following. In 1998, Le Mesurier was seconded to the office of the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina under Carlos Westendorp before being sent to Kosovo in the summer of 1999 after the deployment of the Kosovo forces to the province. 1999 to 2000, Le Mesurier was appointed intelligence coordinator for Pristina City, acting as liaison officer between intel officers of different national contingents. Le Mesurier left the British Army in 2000. From 2001 to 2002, Mesurier was deputy head of the Advisory Unit on Security and Justice and the special representative of the Secretary General, Hans Heikerup's security policy body within the UN mission in Kosovo. In this position, Le Mesurier acted as political advisor to the UN Police Commissioner and represented the SRSG on civil-military police coordination bodies. From 2002 to 2003, Le Mesurier was advisor on economic crime with the EU mission in Kosovo. But what is very relevant here, who was in charge of Pristina at this point was a guy called Bernard Kouchner, the CEO or the former founder, co-founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and now founder of Doctors of the World, Médecins du Monde. Sorry, I have to translate in my head. Why is this interesting? Because I have a theory. James Le Mesurier in Kosovo, under Bernard Kouchner, converted the KLA, which was a British government-funded Islamist Albanian warlord organization, terrorist organization, criminal organization, into what then became the Kosovo Protection Corps, the Kosovan Protection Security Organization, which is just a joke. Because actually under Bernard Kouchner, what started to happen was the KLA rebranded as a security force, were effectively taking Serbian children, Serbian civilians across the border to what were called the Yellow Houses for organ trade and child trafficking. So under James Le Mesurier, this was happening. Under Bernard Kouchner, this was happening. If we look at the parallels between the creation of, or the transformation, the rebranding of what is effectively a terrorist organization, the KLA, into a security force, what we've seen in Syria is it happening right from the beginning. What we've seen is the white helmets being created as the humanitarian interface for the terrorists, the human shields for the terrorists. Whenever the Syrian Arab army moves to liberate an area, what happens? We get narratives of chemical attacks. We get the white helmets providing the humanitarian context to either call for a ceasefire or to demand further military intervention or to criminalize the Russians and the Syrian government and their allies. So what we've seen, in my view, is a very clear parallel between what James Le Mesurier managed to do in Pristina in Kosovo and what he's now doing in Syria. And I believe that there's an even bigger parallel here. Carla Del Ponte actually wrote very much against UN resistance, but she wrote about the organ trafficking in Kosovo. She investigated it and she wrote about it. And of course, Carla Del Ponte was the one voice when in Ghouta 2013 there were claims of Syrian government chemical weapon use in eastern Ghouta. It was Carla Del Ponte who said it was very likely that those missiles came in from the terrorist-held or the rebel-held areas. So why do I think this is relevant? 18,000 Syrian children, this was a question put to the UN, I'm not going to play it all because it's hideously painful, by a Syrian journalist at the UN. 18,000 Syrian children have fallen victim to organ harvesting.
Yes, sir.
Farhan, today, Dr. Iskaf, a Syrian doctor working in North Syria, reported a staggering number of 18,000 children whose organs have been harvested, mainly in Turkish refugee camps. In Turkish hospitals, when they go for treatment for minor injuries, many of them perished and their organs were totally taken out. What is the Human Rights Council and what other investigations are doing about this? Why should this come from a doctor who works there, not from the United Nations?
Well, first of all, as you know, because of our limited presence on the ground, we don't have any first-hand information about the reports you just cited. We have tried, through the work of the Commission of Inquiry, dealing...
I can't actually listen to too much of that. I mean, but basically what you've got is the UN, yet again, obfuscating what is clearly a crime against humanity. In every single area that I entered, where the White Helmets had been operating alongside Nusra Front, I received testimony in East Aleppo, in Ghouta, in Dara, of the trafficking of children, of the taking of children for organ trade, of the use of warehouses and hangars as operation chambers for the organ trade. So we are seeing, in my opinion, a repetition of what was happening in Kosovo, again under James Le Masurier's stewardship, but effectively that means under British intelligence stewardship. And what I want to just show you to finish here is, I actually picked this up. It's a White Helmet, one of their promo videos. But when I watched it, I just found, I always find their videos very bizarre. Most of the time, in my opinion, and this has been corroborated by civilian testimony, it looks very much like they've either drugged a child and buried it and then dug it up again for the film. They abuse and exploit children to promote their organization, in my opinion, my very considered and evidenced opinion. But I just want you to watch this video because this was put out as the White Helmets rescuing children. But I actually had the video translated and it's a little bit different to how it's portrayed. One, you do not pick up an injured child like this. Why are there only children in the ambulance? And that also has the Turkish crescent on the ambulance. So basically the mother is screaming for her son to get out of the ambulance. Thank you.
Can you tell us anything about what's going on in the minds of these terrorist groups, the different groups?
Yeah.
So it's very hard to understand what they're about.
Yeah.
As supposed to be Islamic or nationalist, or they just hate the government. I mean, it's very hard to understand why these people are behaving this bestial way against their brothers and sisters, really. Can you give us some insight into that?
Or I think I'd query, first of all, the idea of them being brothers and sisters. When, for example, the ISIS terrorists invaded the villages around Sweda, which is in the south, it's the Druze community, to the south of Damascus. In one village in Shrehi, they managed to kill all of the ISIS terrorists. Very few of them had Syrian passports. Most of them, I think, from memory, the nationalities were Egyptian, Somalian, Chechen, Ugya.
Are they mercenaries?
Yeah, basically.
Nearly all of them.
Yes,
So
huge majority.
So this Islamic extremism narrative is not really true then?
No.
Okay.
What, in the sense of we're fighting?
Oh, yeah, we're fighting for Allah. That's not true at all.
It's a very, I mean, that's a bit simplistic. ISIS, there is an ideology behind it, of course, because they're being financed by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. Saudi Arabia has a Wahhabi ideology, so an extremist Islamist ideology. Qatar has an Ikhwan, a Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which is a political Islam. The way I tend to actually look at it, if you look at Wahhabism, if you look at Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood, if you look at Zionism, if you take away the religious aspect, if you look at it only as a political movement, they all have exactly the same ideology, which is supremacist, elitist, racist, and all three were certainly, Wahhabism and Ikhwan were created by Britain. The House of Saud was created by Britain. Zionism was certainly aided and abetted by Britain. So if you look at the three movements, and that's why there is now a close relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, for example, in the Syrian project, right? Because it serves the aims of both nations to destabilize Syria and to partition it, to remove a strong government, etc., and to destabilize that. Syria is the hub of that region. If you look at it, it's the center of the wheel. So where I struggle is the idea that these are a grassroots brothers and sisters Syrian revolution against the government, because this so-called revolution was being planned. I mean, if you listen to Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, he was approached by British government officials in 2009 who told him that they were planning to finance and foment the insurgents in Syria. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, as I said, the Ikhwan element inside Syria. Those have been consistently used as a tool for destabilization. If you go back to 1982, the Hama uprising, which was preceded, I mean, everybody remembers the fact that Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, led the massacre against the Muslim Brotherhood, but what nobody ever tells you is the campaigns of suicide bombings and massacres of Syrian Arab Army cadets, etc., that led up to that final campaign to try and suppress that uprising, which was again financed and led by the CIA. Those documents have come out now. The Department of Intelligence Agency documents have come out corroborating that idea. So, you know, I think, yes, of course there is an Islamist ideology behind it. There is an extremist ideology behind it, but in my experience, from what I've seen on the ground, this is beyond anything Islamic. I would actually put it more in an occultist, Satanist bracket. Because what they do, the dismemberment of corpses. I was told by people in Kafraya and Fua, two villages that are now fully evacuated but were previously besieged by Ara, Sham and Nusra Front, when their own were killed, they would impale the bodies on stakes and put them up as terrifying edifices for the civilians inside Kafraya and Fua. I mean, this is not normal. This is not Islamic behavior. This is something beyond that. And of course, they're drugged up. You know, they have Captagon, which is an adrenaline.
It's very hard to see the Westerners who are leading this as anything other than Satanists, really, isn't it? It's very hard to see them as being anything other than beyond our understanding in a way. There's a wickedness there.
It's inhuman.
It's impossible for ordinary people to really understand what's going on with these people.
In Sweden, for example, a disabled child had his head cut off while he was sleeping. You know, and that's something relatively mild, trust me, from some of the stories that I've heard inside Syria.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, sure.
Surely there are parallels with the so-called Afghani freedom fighters of the 1980s under the American campaign against the pro-Russian government in Afghanistan, with the whole Al-Qaeda network being set up there under Brzezinski and all those top figures in American intelligence.
Well, Hillary Clinton admitted that,
So I think it started really in modern times with that Afghani campaign. With, for instance, another example was Nicholas Bethel with his really free Kabul. He's an intelligence agent working for this campaign. So I think they
and of course those mujahideen, or many of them, then came back into Yemen and then became the Al-Qaeda threat that was declared in 2009 by Obama. So you're off to us.
Roy, you know, when the Syrian war first started out, trying to keep up with everything and who was doing what. And then I can't remember who it was, but somebody quite respected said, well, actually, you don't have to follow who that are. You know, the Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, the Jaish, Al-Sham, whatever it is, they're all basically the same.
Yeah.
And they're just divided up so that the Americans call them moderate.
They're rebranded.
That's obviously simplistic, but is it basically right?
It's pretty right. I mean, you know, they try to portray the fact that Nusra Front, for example, is fighting ISIS. It's nonsense. The only thing they will fight over is money or territory or equipment. I guess the best way to describe it is like gang warfare. You know, like, for example, in Idlib, now the majority of the opposition groups, to call them that, have come under the banner of Al-Qaeda, HTS, which is a rebranding of Nusra Front, have now co-opted the majority of the militant groups in Idlib. So now they're pretty much all Nusra Front. So they're all Al-Qaeda.
So how many of them are actually mercenaries rather than fighting for an ideology?
I mean, I just find the whole ideology argument so difficult to comprehend. I mean,
you see, particularly in Idlib, you know, because all the rebels they kicked out of all the other towns, all went to Idlib.
So then they came to Idlib, but also they're still coming in from Iraq, for example, through Turkey.
But I mean, they do seem to be holding out there. You know, they're not running away, are they? I mean, when it looked like the Russians were going to go in there. They didn't.
Well, they're holding out there because Russia has negotiated. So I'm going to have to sit down. Because Russia has negotiated a ceasefire, which actually effectively.
But Russia and the Syrians were going to go in and clear out Idlib, weren't they? And there was a lot of the rebels left, but quite a lot stayed. And to me, that suggests that there is an ideology there rather than just mercenary undertakings. Because they were going to get killed. You know, it did look like
the Americans threatened war, didn't they? The Americans threatened the Russians with war when they were, at the time when they were expected to go in, and there was a kind of a negotiation. I'm not sure of the details, but
no. I mean, I think you're correct in some ways, but I think I was actually in Syria when the ceasefire came into effect, and as I said, the Christian towns of Mahada and Skelbia had just been targeted, which are on the borders with Idlib. But effectively what Russia did at that point was to outmaneuver the United States, because at that point the rhetoric was building up that not only if there were a chemical attack would they attack, but if there were any attack on Idlib. The Americans started to change the rhetoric at that point to make it very, very brinkmanship rhetoric. And so what Russia did was to basically sort of deflate the whole thing by by negotiating with Turkey for the buffer zone from which the armed groups were supposed to remove their heavy weapons, which they did temporarily, but then they brought them back in very quickly. But the problem with Idlib, I don't think it's an ideology as such. What it is the control in Idlib by other nations. So you have Turkey controlling, for example, the Al-Qaeda elements and the Free Syrian Army elements. You have Saudi Arabia financing specific elements within that group, within Idlib itself. You have the US, the UK. I mean, the UK has just announced that it's going to be sending humanitarian aid into Idlib. You know, humanitarian aid, which of course translates into finance and weapons, right? There are other militants, mercenaries, from all number of countries coming in from Iraq during the ceasefire into Idlib to reinforce positions there. So no, I don't think you can purely say it's an ideology. What you can say is that these are chess pieces being moved around by global powers, such as Turkey, such as Saudi Arabia, even to a lesser extent now Qatar. But there are huge influences there. What Russia is attempting to do politically and diplomatically is to sort of keep a lid on it for now. But what we've seen since the chemical attack on last Saturday, and I went to Aleppo 2 days after that, over 150 people affected by what is looking now like a compound of, I think it's ammonium nitrate and some other form of irritant, which created symptoms of constriction of the throat, streaming eyes, difficulty breathing, etc. Since then, what we have seen are surgical strikes on what are known to be terrorist positions around to the west of Aleppo. And in the last few days, the towns of Skelbia and Mahade have been under high alert because, again, it's coming up to Christmas. And so last night they were firing Grad missiles into areas around Skelbia. So they were on high alert then. So we're still in a very, very precarious position. But what I would say, more than it being a reason, the reason they are there is ideological, I'd say it's more to do with the global powers that are controlling those entities inside Idlib. And that includes the US coalition in Britain.
Okay, James.
Could I suggest that it has got an ideological basis in the sense that ISIS was originally conceived when Israel was formed. It was, they called it the Islamic Caliphate. They wanted to establish a caliphate in order to take back Palestine from the Zionists. And that the people in that party became the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. And when we dissolved the Ba'ath Party, when what's his name, Bremer, said nobody from the Ba'ath Party is to be allowed to take any political positions in Iraq, they all left the country or disappeared into the sand, as it were, and formed, I believe, ISIS. So with the intention of continuing that caliphate idea. Now, it doesn't sit very well with the way they behave, but I think Israel was frightened of this caliphate idea gaining ground, and so they infiltrated ISIS with real terrorists, in other words, people who were prepared to cut people's heads off and film it, so that it got a bad reputation for ISIS, and therefore mollified the movement, which is really what's happened.
We only heard about ISIS in 2013. That's the first we heard. Yeah. And that happened directly after there was American soldiers went onto YouTube saying, I didn't join the US Army to fight for Al-Qaeda in Syria. Yeah. The Al-Qaeda brand was trashed. The American military saw through it. They started turning against their government, and all of a sudden you get this new brand, this ISIS. So that's the first we saw of it. Yeah.
That's right.
But also ISIS are not in Idlib, by the way. ISIS are not in Idlib. So, we were talking about Idlib, so I was talking about Idlib not being so much of an ideological...
Yes, question.
Yeah.
Have you perhaps exposed or contacted the heads, such as the Cox 5 and so on, to ask them what they're doing, or do they realise what they're doing?
The heads of what, sorry?
Of the Cox 5, the heads of these organisations. The prim and proper chaps who went to the right school, that sort of thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're not too keen on speaking to me. If you want to try and contact them, by all means do try and let me know what they say. No, I have attempted. Yeah, no, I have attempted.
And any response?
No.
No.
I think they're under strict instruction not to talk to me, actually.
Get a response from Cameron to come and tell us why you were
You can't pay them so much.
Yes. A few minutes ago, I
Yes.
hear you, but you
said something about the fighters being drugged up. Did I
Yeah.
hear correctly?
Yeah.
Can you say, that's the first I've heard of that narrative, so can you just say a little bit more about
If you actually do a quick search on Libya and Captagon, you will see that I think that's the first use of Captagon. What basically Captagon does is in stressful environments, your body creates adrenaline to enable you to deal with it. But normally your body has a natural inhibitor which prevents the adrenaline continuing to rise. What Captagon does is it prevents that inhibitor working. So basically these guys are kind of permanently high. And what you will hear, for example, and that's what I've heard throughout Syria, in Malula, for example, the Christian town that was overrun by Nusra Front in 2013, I've spoken to members of the Christian community that took up arms to defend their town. And what they told me was that they were literally pumping these fighters full of bullets and they were still walking towards them. And that's basically what Captagon does. You can't feel pain. You just keep functioning.
Where does this drug come from? Is it some CIA thing?
That's a good question. I'm pretty. I don't know who effectively produced it in the beginning. I would guess it's an American drug. But if you look it up, you'll find it both in Libya and in Syria. And as I said, reports from almost every single battle zone that I've visited after its liberation. I've been told, even in Sweden, they told me that they were shooting these ISIS fighters, pumping them absolutely full of bullets, and they were still walking towards them. So what it effectively does is enable these fighters to keep fighting through any conditions. So they're drugged up, basically.
Yeah, I was interested in what you said about James and Leslie earlier.
Yeah.
And the way this all, for me, it goes back to Yugoslavia. I mean, the strategies that were involved in Yugoslavia were very similar.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the war that's really being fought is being fought in the media.
Yeah.
It's being fought here. It's not being fought there.
Yeah.
I mean, we heard, at the time of Srebrenica, we heard nothing about Krajina, nothing. But ethnic cleansing was going on. The Serbs were being driven out of a whole area of Yugoslavia. The children had to drive the lorries because there were no men. The men were all enlisted and fighting. Not a word in the media. And so if you want to understand Srebrenica, you've got to understand that there was meant to be a huge prisoner exchange, a vast prisoner exchange. No Serb prisoners turned up. So we don't get the news, and unless we can fight this battle in the news, here and in the media, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Sweden massacre that I talked about, we actually contacted Alison Banville, a very good friend, the co-founder of BS News. She contacted Jon Snow, and she actually said, I can't find a report on the Channel 4 website about one of the worst massacres of the 8-year conflict. And the prevarication from Channel 4 was quite extraordinary, the excuses they put out. And basically what it meant was they didn't care, because this massacre didn't feed their narrative. So you're right. I mean, wars cannot happen without the media manufacturing consent. The information war is actually, I won't say it's the most important war, because the Syrian army has sacrificed so much to maintain control of Syria against what is effectively a foreign invasion. But the information war is incredibly important. And I think all of us have a duty when our governments are effectively going to war, whether it's publicly announced or not. The fact is we are at war right now, and we have been for 8 years and even longer. Then we have a responsibility to inform ourselves and as many people as possible as to the truth of what is really going on.
Hillary Clinton a few years ago said we're losing the information war. Do you think that's true now?
Yeah, I do actually think that's true. If you actually look at what we've got going on now, the DFR labs, the Atlantic Council, Bellingcat, we've got a huge army of censorship implementers coming at us now. Why are they coming at us? Because they need to. Because public consensus is being influenced. by independent voices, by independent media, by alternative channels, and by, I would hope, by us transmitting the voices of the Syrian people that have been completely ignored and marginalized for the last 8 years by the mainstream media. And I think the trust gap between the mainstream media and the public is now almost unbreachable. I mean, I think
certainly
now,
in this country,
yeah.
I now live in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
On 2 occasions, I've gone into a newsagent and said, have you got a copy of the Daily Lyre? And they're daft. I mean,
yeah.
guarantee it.
Yeah.
People understand. I saw some more hands go up. Yeah, I think you were.
I was wondering, like, and back on the issue of ideology, why do you think it is that in the Middle East they tend to, there seems to be a different strategy if you look at like Latin America and Venezuela or in China when they try to destabilize the society, they typically target certain demographics like students or people who are on quite privileged trajectories who resent the current regime, which generally has done something to remove their privilege and even out the society economically. And they have a concrete economic interest in like restoring the old privileged glory. Whereas, I mean, what kind of people do they tend to recruit as the terrorists, and why is it that there's such a focus on like Islam and terrorism and just chaos and violence in the Middle East, and why is there a different strategy rather than like elsewhere?
No, I think that's a very good question. I mean, the demographic in Syria, I mean, funnily enough, we were just discussing this over the last, I was just in Bulgaria and I was discussing this with Syrians in Bulgaria. The demographic that was targeted in Syria was very much the rural areas. If you also go back to 2009, when there was a drought in Syria, and again, this is a very familiar pattern, particularly in that region. You will often see famine or drought preceding an intervention. Now I am going to go into conspiracy theorism, but when I actually looked into that drought, there is a very strong possibility, and actually I think it was somebody affiliated to the Red Cross that had actually looked into it, that Turkey had engineered that drought in 2009, because what did the drought do? It pushed a lot of the rural communities into the suburbs of some of the bigger cities, like Aleppo, like Homs, and like Damascus. And those rural immigrants into those areas, one, then had no possibility to provide for themselves or to educate themselves. Those were some of the poorest areas, coming into some of the poorest areas and some of the most marginalized areas in the suburbs that were poorly educated, that were majority, for example, Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists, because the majority in Syria is actually, I don't like using sectarian terms because Syria is actually a very secular country, but the majority, if you want to look at it in those terms, is Sunni Islam. But the majority, again, is moderate Sunni Islam, not the extremist ideology or not the political Islam that you see with Muslim Brotherhood. But in those poorer areas, in those areas that are perhaps not serviced by the education structure inside Syria, those were the areas that were paid to go to the demonstrations, that were paid to go to the protests, and who were then co-opted into a sort of an Islamist regime which at least ensured that they were paid, that ensured they were given food, water, etc., etc. So, for example, in Eastern Ghouta, what I saw during the liberation was a huge difference to East Aleppo. East Aleppo had always resisted calls to the so-called revolution. It was always loyal to the Syrian government. So when the terrorists actually invaded in East Aleppo, many of those civilians were sort of held there against their will. They were held as hostages, as human shields, and when I saw them when they were liberated, there was genuine jubilation at being liberated. In Eastern Ghouta, it was a little bit different. There you had a large number of Muslim Brotherhood and more Islamist extremists. And when they came out, what I saw, the majority of women wearing the burqa, many of them distrustful of the Syrian government, distrustful of the Syrian army, even though they left by the humanitarian corridors set up by the Syrian government. But when I saw them 2 weeks later, at the refugee camps, it was a completely different atmosphere. They were relaxed, they were being fed, they were being given all of the amenities that they needed before they would be rehomed back into Eastern Ghouta. So I totally see what you're saying, but I think the demographic that was targeted inside Syria were those communities that were poor, that were poorly educated, that were being, to some degree, marginalised. And I think now what we're seeing is the Syrian government attempting to reintegrate them, working through the amnesty and reconciliation agreements, and to reintegrate those communities back into society and to provide education, healthcare, etc. As regards why generally in that region you see a different tactic, I guess to some degree you do have, for example, in all of these countries, you have some degree of sectarianism. But even in Iraq, for example, if you speak to Sami Ramadani, who's an amazing Iraqi analyst, what he will say is that the sectarian divisions were actually more class divisions in Iraq. They were not sectarian divisions. So those sectarian divisions are very much manufactured by the West. But what then happens, unfortunately, they do to some degree become reality. When I speak to Syrians now, what they will say to me is prior to 2011, they would never ask if their neighbour were Sunni or Shia or Alawite, or it never occurred to them. Now, unfortunately, that sectarian narrative has been imprinted upon them, and it becomes very difficult then for them to, they will, because Syrians are a naturally forgiving people. They are a naturally, you know, as one of them said to me very recently, now we start the war of forgiveness. We have to now actually start to forgive people from Syria who have turned against, for whatever reason, against their own people. I don't know if that sort of fully answers your question, but that's very much, you know, what is happening, and we're seeing it in Yemen as well. The use of that sectarian narrative, or the description of it as tribal warfare, when it couldn't be further from the truth.
Okay, Alan.
So is the ultimate goal of these elites to not only bring down Assad, but to make him, to put him before the International War Crimes Tribunal as a war criminal, just as they did with Milosevic? Is that the ultimate aim?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I saw something today. I don't know if any of you are aware of the Caesar report, which was the sort of the new incubator baby report. It was actually commissioned by another Qatari company from memory. And it was the thousands of people that Assad had murdered in prison, etc. And that report has been doing the rounds for some time. If you want to read a very good report debunking it, there's an article by an analyst called Rick Sterling. And if you just Google Rick Sterling and Caesar report, he did an extensive investigation into that. But what I saw actually today, somebody sent me an email that the Caesar report is still being used, as you said, to propel President Assad to the ICC as a war criminal. So although it has been completely discredited, in our opinion, in fact, even Human Rights Watch, I believe, admitted that many of the bodies that were shown were actual Syrian Arab army captives. And photographs were taken of their bodies and used to demonstrate that Assad had been murdering his people. So yeah, there is, I mean, yes, of course there is. And Britain, in my opinion, is leading that drive, that particular drive.
Okay, Tony.
At your overall impression, talking to people you've met outside of Syria and those that have become refugees, do you feel that they would like to go back if they... I mean, as a percentage, say, because presumably there must be some that feel as if they'd like to integrate into Western society. I mean, are there a small percentage, or...?
I think, first of all, you need to put into context the so-called refugee crisis. Of all the refugees, probably less than 20% are Syrian. Which, you know, is not how it's portrayed by Western media. We would assume, but if we listen to Western media, we would assume that every single Syrian is leaving Syria and coming to Europe. There was a report on the BBC not that long ago demonstrating that many refugees, Syrian refugees, are actually trying to go home, and the EU is actually preventing them. When I was in Sweden, I spoke to the head of an NGO there who's working with immigrants, and he said to me, the Syrian refugees are exceptional because the majority of them, as soon as they arrive in Sweden, they're talking about when can they go home.
Well, it doesn't help Western propaganda.
Well, no,
if
of
it
course
gets
not.
out,
So
many of them want to get back.
No, but I mean the majority of genuine, and I say genuine Syrian refugees, so I'm not talking about extremists and terrorists who have come into Europe, by the way. And no, I'm not far right and I'm not a fascist. There are extremist elements that have travelled from Syria through Turkey and back into Europe. But the genuine Syrian refugees, the majority, I would say, want to go home. Unless, of course, they're refugees for another reason, unless they're economic migrants or they've come for education purposes or something else, or to avoid conscription. That, of course, is another reason that some of the young men have left.
Migrants, it's difficult to see how they're going to be enthralled with what's going on here at the moment.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Roy, kind of the narrative amongst everybody who's in the know really is that Syria, Assad's kind of winning the war and that Idlib's kind of the last battle. But that kind of ignores what's going on east of the Euphrates, which doesn't get mentioned anymore. So is Assad giving that up now? Is that...
No.
No?
That's
where all
Assad,
the
no. I mean, Assad, and not only Assad. I mean, I think we need to be careful of making this a discussion only about President Assad. If President Assad stepped down tomorrow, the Syrian people would keep fighting for their independence and for their secular state. And I think that's a very important point to make. You know, the West loves this kind of Hitlerization, as I call it, of any target leader. And then it becomes very polarized. It becomes, you know, you only talk about President Assad. Assad did this, Assad did that. And the army becomes Assad's forces, etc. But I think, no, I mean, President Assad, the Syrian government, the Syrian state is committed to cleansing every single inch of Syrian territory of the US coalition of terror. And I think you're right, in the northeast, and that includes Al Tanf, the military base, and of course the Rukban refugee center, which is right on the borders with Jordan, which is fundamentally under the control of the US coalition, where they're training and recruiting, by the way, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is why they're not allowing UN agencies in, and then claiming that the Syrian government is preventing UN aid getting into the refugees, blah, blah, blah. But basically, the northeast is being controlled by the US proxy, the SDF, which is effectively 80% the YPG, who are ethnically cleansing that area of Christians and Assyrians, by the way. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that is, but what I would also say is the Kurds themselves are a very small minority of the Syrian population. Of that small minority, I think it's around 10%.
But they are concentrated in that one area.
Yeah, but a very small percentage are actually separatists or calling for a Kurdistan, for a state in the northeast. The majority of Kurds are negotiating with Damascus right now. They're not going to come up against the tribal elements in the northeast. And effectively, I think once the US stops power multiplying them, they will come into line with Damascus. That's my impression. But of course, at the moment, what you've got also is Turkey and the US vying for influence just west of the Euphrates in Manbij. At the moment, the US has control of that area, but it's allowing Turkish patrols. Turkey is trying to annex areas in the northwest. I mean, it already has control of Afrin, for example. So, you know, and you've got the UNGA making the declaration that Israel should withdraw from the Golan territory, which was a pretty landmark statement for them to make. But of course, that's going to generate a reaction from Israel, and actually we've got Netanyahu recently saying that, you know, they will invade Lebanon, etc. So it's not over by a long shot. Idlib will be, if they decide to go in, and they're going to have to go in if the attacks by the terrorist entities increase, which I think they will leading up to Christmas. I don't know if they will go in with a full-out military campaign. My gut feeling is they'll go in with surgical strikes and very targeted on-the-ground operations. They're building up troops there.
With or without the Russians?
With the Russians. With the Russians. Yeah. Well, they use the Russians very much for surveillance and for air support. But they are building up troops. There are troops moving up from the south, from the now liberated south. They're moving up to the northwest. So clearly there is build-up for an operation there.
Okay, Alan at the back.
So what is the role of Erdogan's Turkey? Are they simply involved in order to annex territory? Is there some other broad goal?
Well, I mean, you know, I think you have Erdogan's pretensions as the next Ottoman emperor. And what is very important for Turkey is the reduction, in their view, of the Kurdish threat. And, you know, Turkey plays such a criminal game, it really does. It's profiteering, you know, it swerves between working with Russia and being a part of NATO and basically doing the United States bidding. Of course it's looking to annex. I mean, when I was in Kasab, which is in the, hang on a minute, in the northwest, you could see the partition wall that Turkey has built, which is effectively annexing part of Syrian territory there in the north. So yeah, of course they're looking to annex, and if they can't annex, what they're doing now is they effectively have control of Idlib. They're providing the electricity, they're providing equipment, they're providing resources to their militant factions that they control and have incubated inside Idlib. So effectively right now they have control of particularly Idlib city, and of course they have control of Afrin, and they have troops on the ground. You know, so what is their role? To annex more Syrian territory, because of course they annexed already Iskenderun and converted it into Hatay. So they've already taken Syrian territory previously. And of course what they want to do is provide a buffer zone between what they perceive as the Kurdish threat, or the unification of the Kurds along the Turkish border from the northeast to the northwest.
Yes.
Sorry, just for the question. I had a mature moment there. Oh yes, the effects of the Israeli bombing in Syria. Would you know anything about the effects of that?
The effects?
The effect of the bombing by the Israeli Air Force in Syria.
The effect?
Yeah.
Well, I was actually in Damascus when they bombed the coastal area of Latakia. It was pretty minimal, to be honest. I mean, now they have got, I've been a little bit out of circulation in the last few days, but as far as I know, the S-300 defense system is up and running. But even previously, you know, people kind of jump on the bandwagon to criticize Russia when, for example, they feel that they don't respond to an Israeli air attack. But the fact is that the air defense systems that Syria has in place, that, by the way, brought down the majority of the missiles fired by France, Britain, and the US earlier this year after the alleged chemical weapon attack in Douma that has now been completely disproven. The majority of those missiles were brought down by the Syrian air defense systems. But what people don't comprehend is that those defense bases are run by both Syrian and Russian. So while people are complaining, oh, why didn't the Russians do this? Why didn't the Russians start a war with Israel? The fact is that Russia is effectively working and collaborating very closely with Syria on the ground with their air defense system. And now what you have, since that, the effect of that attack on Latakia was to actually increase Russia's resolve to help Syria defend itself against Israel. So it was a home goal by Israel, to be honest, because now Syria has an increased air defense system. And actually since then, there was it did bring down missiles south of Damascus. I think it was about 10 days ago. So it's effectively working. So what it has done is shut Israel up to a large extent.
well, the main reason, of course, was the downing of the Russian surveillance.
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, yeah.
According to the One Israel official news, they've had over 100 bombing sorties, as they explain.
They're great at exaggeration.
Yes, they are.
Exaggeration?
Yeah. Okay. 100 sorties since when?
In the last year.
No.
No, okay.
Regarding just the propaganda thing,
yeah.
Our problem obviously is the usual one, that there's such incredible matrix of wickedness going on that people just can't believe it exists.
Yeah.
The whole media, the whole political system. People just, at least 50% of people just can't just even go near the idea. And we're finding ourselves now that, recognising that globalism is really a permanent revolution, that we have to start kind of supporting things we don't particularly like, which is nationalism, in order to counteract it. So that's kind of going on. But do you ever come across journalists in Syria, from mainstream journalists, and ever speak to them? And have any of them ever sort of said, listen, this is really for people, for us, have you ever come across that kind of phenomenon?
No? Out of a job.
I mean, do they express it? Do you ever find anyone who's actually said, oh gosh, am I selling my soul?
Oh God, no. I think they'd have to find their soul first to decide they've sold it. No, I mean, I did actually have a conversation with a prominent BBC journalist, and I did actually ask them, they were relatively civilised, they did sit down and talk to me. But I asked them. No, I did actually ask them why on earth they were not investigating the White Helmets. Why were they not raising questions for the British government as regards the financing of terrorism? And the response was, "Oh no, that's far too polarising and far too controversial." And I mean, my jaw just hit the ground. I thought, well, hang on a minute, you're a media outlet. Are you not supposed? I mean, surely controversy and something. I mean, it was such a. But this was demonstrative. This is a demonstration of what these media outlets represent. They're just an extension of the foreign policy of our government. That's it.
It's called a salary.
Yeah.
Have I got this right? You can interview the White Helmets, but you can't interview the British press.
No, or the British government.
Yes.
I mean, again, Britain is the mecca of the world of advertising.
Behavioural insight.
We're basically better at advertising and have been leaders, world leaders in advertising. It seems to me that the journalistic world has been taken over by the ethos of advertising, which is, it doesn't matter whether the product is that good. You just have
Advertise
to
it.
reiterate it and reiterate it and advertise it. So in a way, I think that they think they're being journalists, but they've actually turned into...
No, they are marketing agencies for British foreign policy, that's it. There are, I mean, I have to say, I did have the pleasure and the privilege of speaking to Peter Oborne in Damascus. And, there are some real journalists left, actually. And we actually had a really good few conversations, and he did some really great reports last time we were there. Okay, he still has to editorialize them to some degree. But he's a very honest journalist, and there are a few like that are working within mainstream media, but not many.
What you can actually print, isn't it?
Yeah, he is.
I had the same impression. I spent a couple of minutes discussing with him after giving the talk.
Yeah, he's a really he's a decent guy. Oh no, Peter Hitchens is great. I mean, they're both, interesting. They both have columns in the Mail, which of course is vilified by most people. But actually, the Mail has some real mavericks within its organisation, and it does produce some very good reports, some very honest reporting sometimes.
Yes, right. Yes.
You mentioned something about the battle, the war is basically being fought in the news, like over here with Syria. That And I was wondering if you would say that that is the case, and I feel like it is, that the war is really being fought in the West, in the media, to a large extent, more so than like China or Cuba or something. They brag about like the reformists are winning, the moderates are winning in the political system or whatever, and and it's kind of like good news in the business press for people who might be specifically trading with big corporate people who might be specifically trading with those countries, and then they kind of whitewash it for the working classes in the US and UK or whatever in case they happen to overhear it. Whereas here there's like such an emphasis on fear-mongering that ISIS is taking over and they're going to take over the world or whatever, and we're fighting ISIS. And the white helmets, and John Pilger calling it like a propaganda construct, that essentially the battlefields, the antics on the battlefields are basically being done as a prop for the war in the media. It's like a theatrical stunt to change opinions over here. And I was wondering if you would say that it's true that more so in Syria and the surrounding areas that the war is really being fought in the news over here than actually on the ground over there, more so than in other places where imperialism has its tentacles?
No, I wouldn't agree. Because the Syrian Arab Army, when you actually look at the losses in the Syrian Arab Army, this has been an incredibly protracted and bloody campaign on the ground in Syria. If you consider the fact that now they have back full control of over 80% of the country, which is an extraordinary feat by the Syrian army. An army which, by the way, is heavily affected by economic terrorism, by sanctions and embargoes. When you actually look at the weaponry that, for example, ISIS have, and the equipment that they have, the trucks they drive, compared to the ancient weapons that the Syrian army have. A Syrian army soldier is probably on between $30 and $50 a month, if they're lucky. Many of them are in exposed regions where they don't even receive food or equipment or aid or ammunition. So no, I would disagree. I mean, when you actually look at the losses, I mean, for example, just to give you one example, in Tartus alone, which is a coastal town, they've lost 62,000 young men. That's just one area. So the losses to the Syrian army, the losses of young men and women in Syria is vast. And I mean, this is something, for me, this is just one of the crimes of this century, because that's almost an entire young generation that has been wiped out. So I agree with you. The information war is being fought incredibly fiercely over Syria, but that's because Syria is so pivotal to projects against Iran, Russia, China, for example. So Syria, if you like, is the battlefield for all of these global powers militarily, and it is being fought very fiercely on the ground. I mean, in Tilal al-Safa, which is the area that's just been liberated from ISIS fully by the Syrian army, I actually went there 2 weeks ago. They lost 500 soldiers just in that one campaign alone. So no, the war itself is being fought incredibly courageously by the Syrian army, and they have suffered massive, inestimable losses, not only loss of life, but loss of limb. The number of soldiers who've lost limbs, arms, paraplegic. You have an entire generation, very much like Iraq, that are going to be affected for decades. Depleted uranium, the US has used depleted uranium in Syria just as it has in Iraq previously. In fact, in virtually every area of intervention it's used chemical weapons and depleted uranium, even in former Yugoslavia. So I agree with you, there is a vast information war being fought, and it is definitely being led, in my opinion, by the British, because, as you said, they have a history of behavioural change, insight, organisations. I mean, going back to Chatham House, going back to pre-First World War, Britain was the expert in behavioural change, drivers and influencers.
That's why our manners are so good.
That's why we keep saying sorry all the time.
Lord Northcliffe. Yeah, we always smile. Have you noticed the diplomats on television in international conferences? If they're smiling, permanent smile, the British.
Yeah.
I really think you must bomb Syria. Nick?
Would you like to comment on the strict contrast these days between the Guardian and the Off-Guardian? I think that's quite an important new phenomenon. That we have real journalists writing for the Off-Guardian, and they express the kind of sentiments that the Guardian used to express, maybe in the last century sometimes.
Yeah.
What happened to the Guardian? It's sold out, whatever it was before.
Well, I mean, I think the Guardian has now taken over from the Telegraph as the MI6 mouthpiece, hasn't it? I mean, the thing is that the Guardian, I can't remember when it was exactly, but it basically dropped all its decent writers like John Pilger, Jonathan Steele no longer writes for them. It basically sort of culled all its good journalists and brought in a load of spooks, like, for example, what's his name, Martin Chulov. Luke Harding, Martin Chulov, Karim Shaheen. Karim Shaheen is the supporter of the Caliphate, for God's sake. Martin Chulov, I've actually done an investigation into him and how throughout the war he basically entered under the auspices of Nusra Front and ISIS. You know, so clearly, in my opinion, an agent working with the British government inside Syria. The Off-Guardian, my understanding is it was set up by a bunch of journalists who basically took exception at the Guardian's misdirection.
Bloggers.
Yeah.
But one of them was a Guardian writer, was it Ian Knightley? Was he the son of
Not sure.
Because he's one of the people who started the Off-Guardian.
Not sure. Very possibly, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm not that informed on.
He actually did write for the Guardian.
Yeah. Quite very possibly, yeah. But I mean, the Off-Guardian does a fantastic job. I mean, you know, I love them. They do a great job of holding, actually, the Guardian to account.
In a couple of minutes, we have to start clearing up. But then we can circulate and talk to people individually. Yes?
The military equipment that the opposition parties have in Syria, where does it come from?
Oof. Actually, there was a very good investigation done by a journalist, and I can never pronounce her second name, but Diliana. I can write her name afterwards. She'll kill me now. But she did a very good investigation into the Bulgarian weapon trafficking into the terrorist areas, and I think it went in from memory via Saudi Arabia. So it went with the Silk Airlines to Saudi Arabia and then came in through various borders into Syria. But I mean, the weapons in the early days, they were coming in through Libya, Jordan, even Lebanon, actually, in the very early days. Many of them, I mean, some were Russian manufactured. I mean, it's very difficult to pinpoint just one particular manufacturer because weapons, you know, they tend to circulate from country to country. But certainly, I mean, in the last 2 days, I think in Conatra in the south, there was a whole cache of US manufactured ammunition and weapons found. In the south in particular, because the CENTCOM, the Central Command in Jordan that was in control of the southern militant factions, were sending arms in through the Jordanian border, the Nasib border, for example, to the militant groups there. So in the southern areas, in Dara and Conatra, they found a huge cache of American weaponry, but also in Deir ez-Zor when it was liberated, because of course the Americans were supplying weapons into ISIS, etc. there. In almost every liberated area, they found a number of Israeli weapons, American, British, French. I mean, there are French munition experts now in Idlib helping to manufacture and design the chemical weapons like the ones that we used in Aleppo last Saturday. So they're coming in from everywhere, and they're coming in from almost every open border. Now the Jordan border between Syria and Jordan is reopened, so the Nasib border is back fully under the control of the Syrian Arab Army.
How have you managed to survive?
Sorry?
Have you managed to survive?
Who? Me? With the help of the Syrian army.
Have you managed to survive this evening? I'd like to thank Vanessa very much.